Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am happy to be with you for another author interview. I hope you had a good weekend. My weekend was amazing. I went to Lisbon for the first time. I got to see a friend I haven't seen in about 5 years. She actually lives in Belgium, and she's in the reserves, in the Air Force Reserves, and she was on her way to the Azores for military duty, so they came to Lisbon a couple days early, and we met them. My husband and I met them, and that was amazing. Unfortunately, we came home. Husband wasn't feeling so great, and he has tested positive, faintly positive. It's a very, very faint line, but still there, and he feels terrible. So he's tested positive for COVID. We're both vaccinated and boosted, so we're hoping that this means he'll have a very mild case, but I can't tell if my throat actually feels scratchy or, if it's just my usual allergies that I always have. But I think I have psychosomatic or sympathy symptoms with him. I don't know. I tested negative, so hoping he has a mild case, that he doesn't feel worse, hoping that I somehow don't manage to get it. And yeah, that's what's going on in our world. Hope your world is better. I mean, we had a beautiful, wonderful, amazing weekend. It's just the last day or so that's been a little not so great. Anyway, let's talk about books. Let's talk about a book, a memoir, actually, by a woman named Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason. It is, as I said, a memoir. It's called House of Music, Raising the Kanneh-Masons. And, well, let me just give you the back of the book. House of Music tells the story of how a family of 7 siblings, taught at a state comprehensive in Nottingham, took the world of classical music by storm, winning numerous awards along the way and playing to audiences of millions around the globe. With a new chapter on the House of Music in lockdown, COVID, Black Lives Matter, and crisis in the arts. So that is it's a brief description, but it gives you a good idea of this memoir. So the Kanneh-Masons are a family of 9. They have 7 children, all of whom have gotten involved in classical music, have been very successful in classical music. And this is the story of how they came to that point in their lives. It's not just the story of these 7 children and their parents, but their grandparents and some great-grandparents. It's really a story of multiple generations and how those generations ended up creating this particular family in Nottingham, in England, and how music became so important to them, how their culture shaped their love of music, etc. So I really enjoyed the way this book is crafted, the way Kadi weaves in all of those family stories, and you really get to know the generations of their family and how, like I said, how they came to this point. I'm someone who is often fascinated with families and generations and how certain generations veer away from prior generations, or they go back a couple of generations to find family lines and or family stories and family interests, and they pick those back up. So I like I said, I really love how this book is crafted. It is a story full of love and hope, and of course music. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, it is House of Music, Raising the Kanneh-Masons by Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason. Let's turn now to that interview.
Hello, Kadiatu. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you for being here. I'm very excited to have you here to talk about your memoir, House of Music. Before we get to the memoir, though, if you would start by sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
So I'm Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason. I've written the book House of Music, Raising the Kanneh-Masons. I was a lecturer in English at university in the UK, University of Birmingham. But then I had 7 children, so I concentrated on bringing them up and left my career behind, and now I've gone back to writing again. I live in Nottingham in England.
Thank you so much for that. And then this is a memoir. It is about the life of your family and the role that music plays in your family and especially your children's lives. Can you give just an overview of the book as a whole?
So the book is about the experience of bringing up 7 children who have all become classical musicians, very successful classical musicians. They are black children from African and Caribbean backgrounds, being brought up in the UK, and I wanted to explore what it meant for children who are from an ethnic minority to enter classical music, which of course is very undiverse and is very much associated with a certain group and class of people. And I wanted to talk about what the breaking down of those barriers meant and all the issues and I suppose celebrations that come from that. And I thought it was very important to tell that story from our point of view.
Can you talk more about your experience with music, not only for you and your children, but also the importance to your extended family?
Yes, I thought it was very important to point out that, of course, this is not a story that began with my husband Stuart and I bringing up our immediate family into music. This is a story that happened very much from the extended family and is very historical. So that is my husband and I, were both brought up with music. Our parents thought music was extremely important to our education and was a very natural part of our upbringing, and even beyond that, I think. So I started off in Sierra Leone. My father's Sierra Leonean, and within the Mende community in Sierra Leone, music is absolutely naturally and fundamentally part of life. Everybody sings, everybody harmonizes very naturally, and music is very central. And the same in my husband's family. His parents are from Antigua in the Caribbean. But I think more than that, there's always been this yearning for music in both families. So my father, even though he was Mende, brought up in Sierra Leone, was West African, used to dream of conducting an orchestra and playing the piano. And my husband's father, brought up in Antigua in the Caribbean, used to dream of being a violinist. So I think that yearning to become musicians, to become classical musicians, has always been there.
We're going to jump here and take our first break of the podcast. I do want to say something about the sound quality of this episode, and that is, it was a very, very quiet morning in the day of the interview until we started talking, and then the people next door who are doing demolition work decided, and they haven't done demolition work in weeks until the day of this interview, and then there were jackhammers and there were power tools, and it was crazy. I have tried my best to edit out those noises, but I know that it's kind of made some other wonkiness in the audio. So first of all, thank you to Caddy for her patience putting up with that in the background of me talking. I could mute it when she was giving her answers, of course, but yikes. And thank you to you for your patience in my trying to fix that audio. Anyway, let's go ahead and take our first break. When we come back, more with Caddy about the House of Music. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason on her memoir, House of Music. I would imagine that it was a very deliberate choice that you and your husband made to start your children on musical instruments fairly early in their lives. Did they display affinity for music? Did they display interest in music? Just talk a little bit about how the process started for your children getting involved in classical music.
Yes, I think for us it was a very natural process to start them all off in music, because we thought music was fundamentally what all children should have access to. I think all children are very naturally musical, and it's such an important part of expression and creative imagination that it was very natural for us to start them. But I think with Isata, our eldest, we started her off with piano lessons because she just seemed to need something else beyond school. She was very, very bright, but also needing something else to fill up her mind. So we started her off in music, and we were just astonished at how quickly she learned and what an affinity she had for it. And then the others all wanted to follow, and it just very quickly grew bigger than we'd ever imagined. We thought it would be something they would do alongside other things, and then it very quickly became their, I suppose, overarching passion and took over the entire family.
I love that, and I think you can really see that even very early on in the book, where you're waiting for your older son to perform and you're speaking with your then 6-year-old daughter, who is very nervous, and she says something about, what if he doesn't do well, or what if he doesn't achieve the goal that he has set for himself, and you're very kind and supportive of the way that you answer her. But it also shows that the younger children have these incredible role models to look up to in terms of their older sibling. They have someone to emulate and footsteps in which to follow.
Yes, and I think a lot of people say to me, well, how did you manage to get 7 children to practice and go into classical music? That's such an achievement. But actually, I think we were very lucky because they had each other to emulate and to play music with, and because they were not doing it as an isolated project. I think it was actually easier that way. It became a whole family celebration, something that they all very naturally did together. So I think that's exactly why they all carried on loving it as well.
So what then was the impetus that made you decide our story is important, sharing our story is important, and you made the decision to write this memoir?
I think it was because when the children went into music competitions, when we went to concert halls, when we saw music being performed, we would go into a concert hall, for example, and be the only black family in the audience. We would look at the stage. There were no black classical musicians on the stage. And it was something that the children had to be very defiant is probably too strong a word. They had to be very confident about that they could do it. We also got a lot of negative comments. I remember when the boys, my sons, were applying to audition for the Junior Royal Academy of Music in London, and people would come up to us and say, but you're setting them up to fail. This is not a space for black children. This is not somewhere where your family belongs. And I think we very much wanted to prove that children can do anything, and there's no such thing as music that only some people can play, or areas in which certain children can't achieve. So I thought it was very important to get the story out of there as an encouragement, I think, to others, and so that we are not the only ones, and it doesn't end here.
Absolutely, and I found myself being so frustrated on your behalf that you were receiving these comments, that you were still noticing that you were the only family of color in certain circumstances, because this is all taking place in this century, in the 21st century, and you're still getting these comments and noticing the lack of representation. So that reminds me of something that you mentioned in your afterword, where you talk about, yes, there are difficult experiences in this book. There are difficult comments that are made, difficult experiences for your family, but in the end, you say it's really a book about love, and it really is a book about love and hope. So can you talk a little bit about that message of love and hope, and why it was so important for you to include that in this memoir?
Yes, I think absolutely. Music is almost, it's just one of the side stories in a way, because what it is about, partly it's about bringing up children, but it's about how important it is to have love as the basis for interacting with everybody. And also, I think in that we gave them the self-confidence to go out into the world and do anything. It didn't have to be music. I don't think that was ever our ambition, that they would become classical musicians. We wanted them to become anything they wanted to be, and to do that, I think you have to have huge support network, and you have to believe in your children and believe that they can do anything. And also, I wanted to make a point about creativity, that it's so important that children have an outlet for self-expression, and I think that comes through developing creative imagination. So yes, it's a story about overcoming obstacles simply by believing in each other.
So forgive my lack of understanding of the education system in England, but I'm assuming from what I read that your children went to a public school, maybe not in a large urban area, and that it seems like in a lot of public schools in the U.S., at least, arts can be one of the first things that gets eliminated from curriculum. So I don't know if that's the case here, but did you find that you had to make music as more of an extracurricular activity for your kids, or was that opportunity for them in the public school? How did that work in terms of their schooling and their involvement in music and the arts?
I think it's a huge issue in the UK actually at the moment, that arts and the creative education is being run down in state schools. I'm talking about schools that are supported by the government, and I think you call it public schools in America, in the United States.
Yes.
But of course, public schools here means private schools.
Oh, so funny. Okay.
Yeah, in the private school system, there is a huge investment in music and the arts and creativity. In the state school system, the budget for that is shrinking. So we are very concerned that what we call the general population of children is not getting the access to the arts that they should be. So it's becoming even more of something which is reserved for the lucky, privileged few. And so we were very lucky. The children went to a state school that did support the arts and did support music. They are struggling a lot more now with government cuts, but we found that was so essential to their ability to go on and become musicians, and to have the confidence to be themselves and to go into school and bring their instruments to school. And I suppose part of what I do is to campaign for all children to have access to music and the creative arts, and it has to come within school education, I think.
Agreed. Yeah, otherwise some children will not have access to it. They need some place that's accessible.
Exactly, and I think the children who then don't have access are precisely those children who are from diverse communities or from poorer communities and underprivileged communities. And I think then the face of our, not just music, but all our creative arts is going to be a particular part of the population, and that will take so much dynamism out of creativity. So it's very important.
Time for our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be talking a little bit more about the added extra chapter at the end of the book that talks about COVID and how things changed for this family. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am, as you know, speaking with author Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason about her memoir, House of Music. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
The last chapter you talk about, the last chapter takes place right as COVID is starting. And so obviously that changed things for a lot of people in a lot of ways. How did COVID change things for your family? And just talk about that last chapter a little bit more.
So the last chapter was written, the hardback came out in 2020. It had already been written before the pandemic. And then I wrote an extra chapter for the paperback, which covered that year, the 2020 and 2021. And it was, of course, devastating for so many people and devastating for our family. All the children, my older ones, were already in London studying music, or they had very developed international music careers. Everybody came back to Nottingham, to the family home. They had 3 years of concerts ahead of them. 2020 was wiped out immediately. So in terms of their career and their trajectory for the year, suddenly they had nothing. And I think for Stuart and I, we were just devastated and felt very negative about it. But what's wonderful about young people, and I think about them as a family, is they said, okay, we've got this situation, we can't play concerts, we can't communicate with people, so we'll do it online. And so what they did Facebook Lives twice a week, and they had even bigger audiences than they'd had before. And it was a house with so much music in it every day that it became a wonderful time in a sense, even against this background of absolute devastation.
I'm sure there were a lot of disappointments, but I also imagine that it could have been something of a blessing to have everybody back under the same roof, to have yet again a house of music during that time when everyone...
Yes, I think I ended the hardback book. The last chapter was me walking around the family home and being very nostalgic and saying, well, this is becoming the past. I'm looking at all these relics of their music trophies, or their football trophies, or their lives as children. And as a parent, it's very sad watching that as something that's part of the past. And it's called the House of Music and Memories. And then suddenly everybody came home, and it was as though the past had become the present again. So it was wonderful for the younger ones, because suddenly all their brothers and sisters were back, and it was like we'd gone back in time. So it was incredibly magical and very strange as well.
I imagine it was. So since it has been now a couple of years, can you give updates on what everyone is up to at the moment?
So in 2020 in September, my 18-year-old went off to the Royal College of Music to study music, and of course everything was locked down again, so she had a very strange start to college life. But since then everything's opened up. Isata and Sheku, who are my number 1 and number 3, are at the moment touring in the US with music. I've got one son who's living much of the time in Budapest studying violin. I've got another 3 who are studying at the Royal Academy of Music and the Royal College of Music. We've got concerts internationally now, so hopefully everything's getting back to, well, a new kind of normal, I would say.
What do your children think of the book now that it's been written? And did any of them participate in the writing process while you were writing it?
Well, they were incredibly supportive of me writing the book. In fact, the idea of writing the book came from them. A couple of times I said, oh, this is too much work, I don't have the time. And they would say, Mum, go and sit down and write it. They never censored me at all. And when they read the book, they absolutely loved it. So it really felt like a family project, and I think they were fascinated seeing their childhood from my point of view, and also the history of me and my husband's family as well. There was so much that they didn't know, actually, which was surprising. And I think when you see your own childhood from the point of view of your parents, it's almost like a whole new landscape. And we had lots of conversations about it, and which was fascinating. They did have an input in that they read the first draft and they said, oh, the chapter where you talk about how we were doing things that you didn't realise and how naughty we actually were, because I think as a mother I thought my children are angels, I'm completely in control here. And then as time went on I realised actually they have a whole life and world that I am not in control of, and they told me even more anecdotes and stories of, I suppose, ways that they subverted our rules, which I had no idea about. So it was very funny.
Oh no. Hopefully nothing too crazy.
So we just found it very amusing, but I'm glad we didn't know at the time.
Sure. Ignorance is bliss sometimes. What do you hope that readers will take away from the book?
I hope they'll take away the joy of children, and also I want to make it very clear that it's not a book about Stuart and I having these wonderful genius children who we were very lucky to have. I want to show that all children have such amazing potential, and that human life is always an unfolding of what is a miracle that everyone can have access to. And I think when we first had the children, we thought, okay, we can see the future, we can plan everything, it's all very simple. But actually children are a constant surprise, and life is a constant surprise. And the joy of all creativity in the creative arts is that it grows people in ways that astonish everyone, I think.
One final break, and then we'll come back for the conclusion of this interview. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason.
And back to what we were talking about earlier, with just the love that pours through this book. One way that I saw that that really resonated for me was through your anxiety. Sometimes you write about that, you're putting one of your daughters on the train, and you said a couple times, I did what I was supposed to do. I got her on the train. I did this. But then in your head, you're running through the music as she's running through the music. You're concerned, you have probably as much or maybe more anxiety on their behalf. And for me, I really resonated with that, just that love that sometimes, you love them so much, you want them to do well, you want to support them, but there's only so much you can do.
Yes, and I think a lot of people come up to me and say, gosh, you're an amazing mother, look what you've done. And I think, actually, motherhood isn't like that. I went to bed every night worrying that I was terrible, you worry about the things that you're not doing and the things that you can't save your children from, and no one can be a super mum either. And people always come up to me and say, oh, you must be so proud when you sit in the audience and you see your children perform. And most of the time I'm sitting there rigid with anxiety. I'm thinking about all the things that could go wrong. I'm thinking about all the preparation that went before. And I think everything is very fraught. And what you bring, I think, to bringing up children is all your own anxieties and all the things that went wrong in your life. And I have a chapter about failure, and I say, actually, this isn't a book about success. It's a book about acknowledging failure, not being afraid of failure, knowing that any kind of success in any life has to go through obstacles and things that go wrong, and that's exactly the path to success and happiness. So I always try and make that very clear.
Mm-hmm. Now, I normally ask about people's path to writing, and did they know that they wanted to be a writer? With memoirs, it's a little different because not everybody grows up thinking they're going to write a memoir. But you've taught English, obviously you've studied. Is writing something that you thought about before ever, or did this just come as kind of I have this urge to tell my family's story?
I've always written, but of course I was an academic, so I wrote academic papers and an academic book. So this is the first writing that's not academic. And I think I wanted to write, I think with academic writing it's a very particular kind of writing, because you're having to do all the research and you have very strict boundaries. And I think with this book I wanted to say exactly what I felt, with no censorship, with no sense of not having to refer to anybody else. And I think it was incredibly freeing. And I think you can get that from writing fiction as well. But writing a memoir, you are saying, this is my point of view, and this has got nothing to do with any theoretical analysis or anything like that. This is just me and my perspective. So I think that was where the urge came from. Yes, I've always written, but of course writing a memoir is a bit, I suppose, like writing a diary, which of course I've always done as well, or I did as a young person. And I think because writing is something that I have studied and grown up doing, it was a natural way to express myself, because I'm not a musician like my children.
And this is just like one small part at the beginning of the book, but you talk about the journals that your grandfathers wrote disappearing, and my heart just broke when I read that. I know it was only like one small part of a much larger story, but their stories disappearing like that, just for me personally, my heart broke, because you can't read them anymore.
Yes, and I think what I always do is think back to my own grandparents, parents, ancestors, and think, actually this is a story that started so many years ago, and I'm just one end point of that. And I think that urge to write and create and play music and has always been there. And there are so many stories that are lost, and I didn't want these stories to be lost. And I think at the end I say, every story can be told in so many different ways, from so many different perspectives, and this is just one. And I wanted that to be part of a very long story, but one that hopefully is not going to be lost.
Mm-hmm. Have you thought about potentially writing anything else in terms of either memoir, fiction? I mean, obviously academic writing you've done throughout your career at various points, but would you write for publication again, do you think?
Yes, I'm in the middle of two projects at the moment. One is a fiction project, so I'm interested in writing a novel, and the other is writing about the themes that came out of the memoir. And they are themes that people have constantly talked to me about diversity, about racism in the UK and in the world, about music and creative education, all of those issues, about family. And I'm in the process of putting together a book which talks very directly about all those themes.
Wonderful. I look forward to that. Do you have advice for aspiring authors? Maybe someone wants to write a memoir or wants to write about their family's story.
I think as very much a woman writer and a mother, I found the greatest advice I had was from my agent, who said to me, Kadi, if you see a pile of ironing in the corner, ignore it, sit down and write. And I think writing to me felt like such a self-indulgence. I thought, it's something that I'm doing which isn't for my family. I'm not doing the laundry, I'm not doing the cooking, I'm not looking after them at this point. And I think you have to put everything aside and say, this is my time to write, and it's important. And I think for women and mothers, that is a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Actually, that's a whole other, if not a memoir, there's an essay in there for sure.
Absolutely.
When you take time to read for yourself, do you have favorite authors and genres that you tend to turn toward?
Oh yes, I love novels, actually, more than anything, and poetry. So there are some amazing writers from the US, like Toni Morrison, for example, who I've always loved. There's Bernardine Evaristo from the UK. There's Arundhati Roy from India. I love Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Central America. Andrea Levy from the UK. And of course I love all the greats like Jane Austen and Emily Bronte and Virginia Woolf. And so I think I'm quite eclectic, and I just love all reading and poetry. John Keats, Sylvia Plath, but I also love reading history. I think history is really important, and new perspectives on history as well. So yes, a huge range of things.
And what were some of your favorite books to read with your children when they were growing up?
Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy, which is a book that comes out of New Zealand actually. We also loved Quentin Blake, Roald Dahl, Michael Rosen, all things. Oh, Harry Potter, of course. We're huge Harry Potter fans, and we read all the books. So that's still with us.
Wonderful. I just love the name of the first one, Harry McClary. I love things that rhyme. What can I say?
Yes.
How about internet presence? Do you have a website? Are there social media platforms where people can interact with you?
Yes, I have a Twitter site, which is at Kadiatu KM on Twitter. We have a family Twitter site as well, Kanneh-Masons, and a website, kannehmasons.com, and all the children. We have also a family Instagram site at the Kanneh-Masons, and all the children have Instagram accounts as well and Twitter accounts. So all you have to do is look up my name, the name Kanneh-Masons, or Sheku or Isata Kanneh-Mason, or any of them. We're everywhere.
Well, in this day and age, you kind of have to be, don't you? Well, Kadi, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about the book and about your children and music. I really appreciate your time.
And I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again to Kadi for joining me to talk about this memoir, but also for putting up with the construction zone that was my recording area that day. Both are greatly appreciated, but definitely the talking to me about this memoir, very much appreciated. If you are a fan of memoirs, if you are a fan of classical music, if you are a proponent of music and arts in schools, public schools, depending on, I guess that's different in the United States and England, which ones are public, which ones are called private, but you know what I'm saying, hopefully. But if you're a proponent of the arts, you should definitely read this book to find out more about this amazing family, to also find out about arts in school and how much of a difference it can make in children's lives, in young people's lives. Of course, those children and those young people grow up to be adults who have had profound experiences through music, especially this family. They're really amazing. And like I said at the beginning, this book is about love. It's about hope. It is about resilience in some ways, but really that love and that hope and just love of family, love of music, hope that there are better things in the world than sometimes what we experience in the here and now. So a very beautifully written memoir, and you should check it out if you are a fan of memoirs. I hope that you will join me for the next episode. I'll be speaking with author Maisie Eddings about her book. We are going with rom-com this time, and Maisie is not only an author, she is a dentist, and she is a neurodiverse author. I'm excited to have her on the podcast and talk to her about her books and writing and all of that wonderful stuff. So I hope that you will join me for that episode as well. In the meantime, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. If you haven't done so already, if you could please write a review leave a starred review, whichever one is more comfortable. Both help to get the podcast out to more people. And also, if you are not doing so, follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I would love to hear from you. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me what's going on in your lives. I do love hearing from listeners. So hit me up on social media. In the meantime, I already said in the meantime, but in a second meantime, I hope your week is going well. I hope that your weekend goes well, but mostly I hope that between now and the next time we chat, you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.